You will not take them from me. Isabella's voice thundered as she pushed her wheelchair forward, shielding 3 trembling girls from the social worker's stern command. Rain pounded against the glass, lightning igniting her tear-streaked face, while her hands gripped the wheels with fierce defiance. For months she had been silent, broken, but tonight she rose like a mother reborn. And what happened next left everyone in that room breathless. Would you have stood with her too? And now let's begin the story. Rain swept across Florence like a curtain, blurring the glow of the street lamps and washing the piazzas in silver. Alexander Grant leaned forward over the wheel, the wipers barely keeping pace with the storm. For most people, the weather was an inconvenience, but to him it mirrored something deeper, a turbulence he could not quiet. His wealth, his empire, his carefully structured life, all of it seemed powerless when he thought of Isabella upstairs at the villa, silent in her wheelchair, a shadow of the woman who once filled entire halls with music. As he guided the car past the Duomo, his eyes caught movement on the steps. At first, he thought it was debris blown in by the storm, but then a thin arm lifted, followed by the outline of 3 small heads pressed together against the marble. He slowed instinctively, pulse quickening. Children. He pulled the car to the curb and stepped into the rain, his coat instantly heavy, the chill biting through the fabric. They were so small it hurt to look at them. 3 little girls, identical, their wet hair plastered to pale faces. Their knees were drawn tight to their chests, arms wound around each other in an embrace born of desperation rather than comfort. He crouched, speaking softly. "What are you doing here in the rain?" The one in the middle lifted her head first. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, as if she had already learned not to expect kindness. "We're waiting," she said. "Waiting for who?" His voice cracked despite himself. "For someone to come," whispered the girl on the right, her words nearly drowned by thunder. But nobody came. The third girl pressed her face into her sister's shoulder, shivering so violently her teeth clicked. They had no coats, only thin sweaters soaked through. Their shoes were worn, laces missing. Alexander looked around, hoping for a frantic adult, a priest emerging from the cathedral, any sign that these children belonged to someone. The square was deserted. "How long have you been here?" he asked. The middle one, who seemed to carry the burden of speaking for them all, answered without hesitation. "Since the morning." The weight of those words struck him harder than the storm. He imagined them sitting here as the city bustled by, tourists snapping photos, vendors shouting, people rushing with umbrellas, all blind to the trio on the steps. His throat tightened. "And your parents?" The girl hesitated. Then, with a voice that should never have belonged to a child, she said, "Our mother is gone. Our stepfather left us here. He said someone would take care of us." It was not just abandonment, it was a sentence. Alexander felt something crack inside him, something he had long held shut. The girls did not cry, not even as rain ran down their faces. They had passed beyond tears, beyond expecting rescue. "Are you hungry?" he asked. They exchanged quick glances and gave the smallest of nods. The shy one on the left whispered, "We haven't eaten since yesterday." That was enough. He extended his hand. "Come with me. I'll take you somewhere safe." The middle girl studied him with eyes too old for her years. "Not the police," she said. It wasn't a question. It was fear laid bare. "Not tonight," Alexander promised. "Tonight you'll have warmth and food. Tomorrow we'll decide the rest. Do you trust me?" The 3 huddled together, whispering so low he could barely hear. At last, the leader reached for his hand. Her palm was ice cold against his. With effort, she pulled her sisters to their feet. They wobbled, legs stiff from hours of cold, but they followed him down the steps. He opened the rear door of his car. They climbed in silently, clutching each other, their small frames swallowed by leather seats. He turned the heater on high and glanced back. In the glow of the dashboard, their faces seemed softer, but the fear lingered. "What are your names?" he asked gently. "I'm Ilara," said the leader. She pointed to the shy one. "This is Maris," then to the other, "and Lucia." He repeated the names, tasting their weight. "Ilara, Maris, Lucia. You can call me Alexander." The car moved through narrow streets, glistening with rain. From the back came a quiet voice. "Will we sleep in a real bed tonight?" It was Maris. The question pierced him. "Yes," he said firmly. "A real bed with blankets." Another voice followed. "And food, as much as you want." By the time they reached the villa, the storm had lessened, but the night still pressed heavy against the hills. The gates swung open to reveal a grand house lit against the darkness, its gardens dripping with rain. To Alexander, the place often felt like a gilded prison. To the three sisters, it seemed another world. They stood in the doorway, dripping on the marble, hesitant to step farther. He knelt once more, meeting their eyes. "This is your home tonight. You are safe here." Upstairs, Isabella stirred at the sound of unfamiliar voices. For months she had lived in shadows, curtains drawn, music silenced. Now there were echoes she had not heard in years, the high, uncertain notes of children's voices. She wheeled herself toward the landing, every motion slow, her hands trembling against the chair's rims. From below, Alexander looked up, his eyes meeting hers. She was pale, her hair loose, her face sharp with disbelief. "There are children in our house," she said. Her voice was soft, but carried through the hall. "Yes," he answered, steady as the triplets stared wide-eyed at the woman at the top of the stairs. Isabella's gaze lingered on them, then returned to him. "Do you think I can take care of children?" The question hung in the air like smoke, fragile and devastating. Alexander held her eyes. "I couldn't leave them," he said. The villa fell silent, except for the storm's fading whisper. Three abandoned sisters, a broken wife, a man who thought he had no choice, bound together in a single night. None of them yet understood how that choice would remake them all. The first morning, after Ilara, Maris, and Lucia entered the Grant villa, the air inside felt strangely different. For months, the house had been silent, except for the distant ticking of antique clocks and the hollow sound of Isabella's wheelchair moving across wood. Now, faint giggles and whispers slipped into the corners of the halls. Alexander noticed it when he came down to breakfast. The children sat at the table, still dressed in borrowed shirts that dwarfed their small frames, their eyes darting between the silver cutlery and the towering ceiling. They handled each bite carefully, as if afraid it might be the last. Isabella remained upstairs, but she had left her door slightly ajar, something she hadn't done in a year. Alexander tried to establish normalcy. He poured them juice-sliced bread spread jam. The triplets responded with polite thanks. Their voices hesitant, but beneath that politeness lay an urgency born of hunger and survival. He recognized it because he had seen it in his own reflection years ago before wealth softened the edges of his life. As days passed, the girls began to explore the villa with timid steps. They discovered the library first. Ilara, curious and daring, traced her fingers across the spines of books in languages she couldn't yet read. Lucia, the one who seemed to listen most closely to the world, opened volumes and stared at the illustrations with awe. Maris, shy but quietly observant, stacked cushions to build forts in corners, her imagination spilling out in whispers to her sisters. But it was the old nursery that changed everything. Alexander hadn't entered that room since the accident. He had locked it, sealed it away, unable to face the small crib, the half-painted walls, the shelves stacked with stuffed animals still carrying the faint scent of baby powder. That room had been Isabella's sanctuary, once the place she poured her love into when they were preparing for the child they never got to hold. One afternoon, while Alexander was occupied with calls in his office, the triplets stumbled upon the locked door. Children notice what adults try to hide. They lingered there, whispering, testing the knob. Alara, ever the leader, coaxed the others, and somehow they found the courage to tug until the latch gave way. The door creaked open. Inside, dust motes swirled in shafts of late afternoon light. The girls stepped cautiously across the threshold, their eyes wide at the sight of toys arranged with care, tiny blankets folded neatly, shelves lined with picture books. For them, it was a kingdom of forgotten treasures. For Isabella, hearing the faint laughter from above it was the reopening of a tomb. She maneuvered her wheelchair to the base of the stairs, heart pounding. She had tried to ignore the sound, at first, the high excited chatter drifting through the air, but when she realized it was coming from that room, her body trembled. She hadn't allowed herself to see it in over a year. Her hands shook against the rims of her chair as she pulled herself upward, each turn of the wheel a battle between dread and curiosity. At the doorway, she froze. The three girls were inside, pulling stuffed animals from the shelves, trying on baby hats far too small for their heads, arranging blocks in clumsy towers. They looked up and saw her. For a moment, no one moved. Ilara was the first to speak, her voice soft. "Was this your baby's room?" The question pierced Isabella. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her chest ached as though someone had ripped open an old wound. She gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white. "Yes," she whispered finally. "It was." Lucia held up a tattered picture book. "It's beautiful. Did you make it this way?" The simplicity of the question disarmed her. She remembered the hours spent painting stars on the ceiling, stitching curtains with golden threads, arranging every toy with a mother's anticipation. "I did," she answered, her voice breaking. Maris stepped forward timidly, holding a small stuffed bear, its fur worn from waiting. "He never used it." Isabella's throat tightened. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. "No," she said, each word trembling. "He never got the chance." The triplets didn't understand the full weight of her grief, but they felt it. Children sense sorrow more clearly than adults. Without hesitation, they placed the toys back on the shelves, their small hands surprisingly careful. Then Ilara approached Isabella and rested her hand lightly on her arm. "We can play here for him," she said, "so the room isn't lonely." Isabella's breath caught. The suggestion was both unbearable and strangely comforting. For months, she had refused to acknowledge the room's existence, yet here were these children inviting her to let the silence break. From that day, the nursery became their meeting place. The girls spun tales of imaginary kingdoms where lost princes returned, where broken things healed, where mothers never left. They laughed, sang lullabies half-remembered from their own mother, and sometimes asked Isabella to join. At first, she refused, lingering at the doorway, watching with aching eyes. But gradually, she began to roll her chair inside to sit near them as they built towers, or pretended the crib was a ship crossing seas. The echoes unsettled her. The sound of their voices awakened memories she had buried, the softness of a lullaby she used to hum at the piano, the weight of expectation when she pressed her hands over her stomach, the violent silence of the hospital when she realized her child was gone. The girls had no idea. Yet they stirred it all back to life. At night, Isabella lay awake, torn between dread and longing. Alexander noticed the change. He found her sitting by the nursery door more than once, her fingers running along the wood as though it were a scar. He tried to reassure her, but he too was unsettled by how quickly the children had reopened wounds. Still, he could not ignore the faint light in her eyes, a spark of presence he hadn't seen in months. Then came the evening that nearly undid her. The triplets had learned the piano stood silent in the corner of the living room. Alara begged to press the keys, and eventually Alexander agreed. The girls climbed onto the bench, fingers stumbling across notes. They were clumsy, but together they created a sound that filled the house. A lullaby emerged, not flawless, but hauntingly familiar. Isabella froze in the doorway. It was the same melody she used to play during her pregnancy, the one she had sworn never to touch again. Her body shook, her hands covering her mouth. She wanted to shout to stop them, but her voice failed. The girls continued innocent, weaving fragments of her past into the present. The music spread like a ghost through the villa, stirring every hidden ache. Alexander moved to stop them, but Isabella lifted her hand, surprising even herself. She could not bear it, but she also could not bear to silence it. She listened, tears streaming down her face, caught in a storm of love loss, and the unbearable truth that life had forced her into stillness while the world continued to move. That night, when the piano fell quiet, Isabella wheeled herself back to the nursery. The triplets followed silently, sensing her fragility. She looked at the crib and then at them. "You don't understand what you're doing to me," she said, her voice breaking, but maybe that's the point. The ghosts of her past had returned, carried not by malice but by innocence. And though it terrified her, some small part of Isabella knew she could no longer hide from them. The nights in the Grant villa grew heavier as autumn deepened, carrying with them a strange tension that neither Alexander nor Isabella could quite explain. The triplets had become a constant presence, their laughter bouncing against the stone walls, their footsteps pattering through rooms that had been mute for too long. Yet beneath the joy, Isabella felt something stirring inside her, something unsettling, like an old wound reopening too quickly. One evening, while Alexander stayed late at the Florence restaurant, overseeing a private event, Isabella found herself alone with Alara Maris and Lucia. The storm outside had returned, rain lashing against the windows, lightning carving the sky into fragments. She sat in the living room, a blanket wrapped around her legs, trying to focus on the pages of a book. But the girls had vanished upstairs, their whispers drifting down faintly. A cold unease spread in her chest. When the sound of the piano reached her ears, Isabella's body stiffened. It was faint at first, hesitant notes pressed one after another, but soon the melody grew into something unmistakable, the lullaby she had once played every night during her pregnancy. The very song she had sworn never to hear again. Her breath caught. She pushed her chair toward the staircase, every turn of the wheel a struggle between terror and compulsion. The music grew louder, filled with innocent mistakes yet hauntingly familiar. As she reached the landing, she saw them, the three little girls sitting together on the piano bench, their small fingers pressing keys in unison, clumsy yet determined. They had dragged chairs closer to reach properly, their faces lit by concentration. For a moment, Isabella couldn't breathe. The sound was too close, too raw. She saw flashes of herself a year earlier, her belly swollen, her hands gliding across the same keys, while Alexander leaned in the doorway, smiling. Then the crash, the hospital, the silence. The music became unbearable. "Stop!" she cried out, her voice sharper than she intended. The girls froze, their hands lifting from the keys. They turned slowly, their eyes wide with fear. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to fall into silence too, as if the whole world waited for what would follow. Isabella pressed her palms to her chest, her body trembling. "Do you know what you're playing?" she asked, her voice breaking. Alara shook her head. "We just found the song in the old notebook by the piano," she whispered. "We thought it was beautiful." The words pierced Isabella. She had forgotten the notebook even existed, filled with her handwritten scores and lullabies. To hear them again through the uncertain fingers of these children was almost unbearable. Her eyes burned with tears. That was my son's song, she whispered. Maris climbed down from the bench, clutching the hem of her oversized shirt. We didn't mean to hurt you, she said timidly. Isabella's sob broke free, raw and unguarded. The girls rushed to her, their small hands grasping her arms, her blanket, her trembling fingers. Their presence was overwhelming, suffocating even, and for a moment she wanted to push them away. But when she looked down into their faces, earnest, frightened, desperate to make it right, something inside her cracked open. The storm outside rumbled thunder, shaking the windows. Isabella bowed her head, her tears falling onto Ilara's hair. You don't understand, she whispered. You can't possibly understand. Ilara, her voice steadier than her years, said softly, Maybe we do. The words struck Isabella like lightning. She looked into their eyes and saw not just children but survivors, each carrying grief of their own. They had lost their mother, had been left behind by the one person meant to protect them. They knew abandonment, emptiness, fear. Perhaps they did understand in their own way. The realization terrified her. These children were drawing her out of the prison she had built for herself, tearing open wounds she had thought safely buried. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath her. Yet beneath the fear was something else, an ember she hadn't felt in so long, connection. Isabella lifted her trembling hand and touched Lucia's cheek. The girl flinched at first, then leaned into the gesture as if starved for it. Maris pressed closer on the other side, and Ilara, strong and protective, wrapped her arms around Isabella's waist. The wheelchair became a cocoon, holding 4 souls who had been broken in different ways. When Alexander returned home that night, soaked from the rain, he stepped into a house transformed. From the hallway, he heard voices, 4 of them. He followed the sound to the living room and stopped, frozen. Isabella was there, seated in her chair, but alive in a way he hadn't seen in more than a year. She was telling a story, her voice animated, her hands painting pictures in the air. The girls sat cross-legged around her, their eyes wide, their faces glowing with wonder. And the dragon. Isabella said, giving the creature a deep, rumbling voice, wasn't truly evil. He was just lonely. He wanted someone to see him for who he really was. What happened then? Lucia asked, clutching a pillow. 3 brave princesses came. Isabella continued glancing at each girl in turn. They looked past the scales in the fire and saw his heart. And because they did, the spell was broken. Alexander's throat tightened. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, the storyteller, the dreamer, the one who could make any child feel safe in her presence. For months, she had been lost in shadows, and now she was shining again. Isabella noticed him then. For an instant, uncertainty flickered across her face. But when she saw the tears in his eyes, she offered the smallest, most fragile smile. Alexander stepped closer, unable to hold back. "You're alive again," he whispered. The girls looked between them, not fully grasping the weight of his words, but sensing something sacred. They climbed onto Isabella's lap, wrapping their arms around her as though sealing the moment. For Isabella, the awakening was terrifying because it forced her to confront everything she had buried. Yet it was also undeniable the ghosts of her past had not destroyed her. They had carried her trembling and unwilling back into the light. The knock at the Grant Villa came early on a Tuesday, crisp and official. Isabella had been in the kitchen with Ilara, Maris, and Lucia, helping them slice fruit for breakfast, when the sound echoed through the halls. Something in the tone of it, a sharp rap deliberate, made her stomach twist. Alexander opened the door to find a woman in a tailored suit, a leather satchel at her side, her expression steady and unreadable. She introduced herself as Rosa Bianchi, a representative of the Department of Child Welfare in Florence. "We received notice of 3 minors living here without legal guardianship," she said plainly. I need to verify their situation." The triplets had followed quietly, standing behind Alexander, their small hands clutching the folds of his jacket. Rosa's eyes softened at the sight of them, but her tone remained professional. Isabella wheeled forward, placing herself deliberately between Rosa and the children. Her voice, though trembling, carried conviction. "They are not just living here. They are our family." Rosa listened, but began explaining procedures, the need for temporary custody, foster placement evaluations, and court hearings. The words sliced through the warmth that had been growing in the household, a reminder that love alone was not enough to secure permanence. The girls stiffened with panic. Maris buried her face against Isabella's lap. Alara tried to stand taller, as if to shield her sisters, while Lucia whispered, "Please, don't take us away." That plea ignited something in Isabella. She spoke with a passion she hadn't known she still possessed. "I lost a child once," she said, her voice raw but unwavering. "I thought my life was over, but these girls have given me back the will to live. They are not temporary guests. They are my daughters. You cannot undo what has been born here." Alexander stepped forward beside her. His voice was calm but resolute. "We are prepared to go through every legal channel. We will not let them be separated again. We'll do whatever is required: background checks, financial audits, psychological evaluations. Start the process today." Rosa studied them for a long moment. Her professional mask wavered as she looked again at the children pressed close to Isabella's wheelchair. She finally nodded. "Then we begin immediately. But understand, this will not be easy." And it wasn't. The weeks that followed were filled with interviews, home visits, and endless paperwork. Social workers scrutinized Alexander's business empire, questioning whether his demanding career could coexist with fatherhood. Psychologists probed Isabella's mental health, challenging her readiness to parent after so much trauma. The couple endured every question, every doubt, with a quiet determination that astonished even the professionals. At night, when the villa was finally quiet, Alexander and Isabella would sit together, exhaustion etched across their faces. Yet each time they looked at the girls sleeping peacefully in the guest room, they found strength again. The fear of losing them was unbearable, but it forged a fierce unity between husband and wife. The day of the hearing arrived on a bright morning in December. The courthouse in Florence loomed heavy with history, its marble halls echoing with footsteps. Inside, Alexander wore a dark suit. Isabella sat upright in her wheelchair, and the triplets wore matching dresses chosen with care. They held hands tightly, 3 small knots of resolve. Judge Romano presided, his silver hair gleaming under the lights. He sifted through the thick file of reports, his expression unreadable. "This is an unusual case," he began, "but not without precedent. I must be convinced not only of your capacity to provide, but also of the depth of this bond." Alexander rose first, speaking of stability of resources, of the ability to give the girls a future filled with education and security. His words were measured, practical. But when Isabella spoke, the room grew still. She did not deliver rehearsed statements. Instead, she told the truth. "These girls found me broken," she said simply. "They walked into a house of silence and filled it with life. They have healed me in ways no therapy, no medicine ever could. I love them not as replacements for the child I lost, but as the daughters I was always meant to have. If you send them away, you don't just take children from a home, you rip apart a family already stitched together by love." Her voice shook but did not falter. Tears glistened in her eyes, and even the clerks paused their pens. Judge Romano turned to the triplets. "And you children, what do you want?" Alara, steady and brave, stepped forward. "We want to stay. They love us like no one else has." Lucia added softly, "This is the first place that feels safe." Maris, clutching Isabella's hand, whispered, "We don't want to be left again." The judge leaned back, removing his glasses. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the creak of his chair. Finally he said, "In my years on this bench, I have seen many families formed by law, fewer by choice, and rarer still by destiny. What I see here is extraordinary." His gavel fell with finality. "The adoption is approved. From this day forward, Ilara Maris and Lucia Grant are your daughters in every sense." The courtroom erupted in tears and laughter. The girls clung to Isabella. Alexander wrapped his arms around all of them, and even Rosa Bianchi allowed herself a small smile. Outside, the bells of Florence rang as if the city itself were bearing witness. The battle of love and law had been fought, and for the first time in a long time victory belonged entirely to the heart. Winter gave way to spring in Florence, and with it the Grant Villa bloomed into something it had never been before, a true home. The gardens Alexander once kept manicured for prestige now overflowed with daisies planted by Ilara sunflowers that Maris tended with patient care and lavender Lucia claimed as her own. The once silent halls now echoed with laughter, arguments over board games, the sound of spoons clinking against bowls of Isabella's homemade soup. Life had not just returned, it had taken root. Every morning began with small rituals that bound them together. Alexander, who once lived by the strict rhythm of business meetings, now woke earlier to prepare breakfast with the girls. He had become clumsy at flipping pancakes, often burning the edges, but the triplets cheered anyway as if he were a magician. Isabella would watch from her chair, her smile carrying a warmth he thought he'd lost forever. School became the next chapter of transformation. The girls, who had known only absence and uncertainty, now walked hand in hand into the gates of a small private school nestled in the Tuscan hills. At first, they clung to each other shy and wary, but within weeks they returned with stories of classmates, of books borrowed from the library, of teachers who praised their curiosity. For Alexander and Isabella, each recounting was a quiet miracle. At night, Isabella rediscovered her voice as a storyteller. The living room became their gathering place. Blankets thrown across the floor, the fire crackling. She wove tales of enchanted forests, brave queens, and hidden kingdoms. Sometimes the triplets added their own twists, giggling at their inventions. Other times they listened in reverent silence. The storytelling was more than entertainment. It was healing, a thread binding them through shared imagination. But perhaps the most profound change was within Isabella herself. Once a prisoner of grief, she now embraced her new role with grace. The wheelchair was no longer a cage. It had become a throne adorned with stickers and flowers the girls added every week. They called her Mamma Bella, a name born naturally one evening, spoken by Maris with a mixture of shyness and certainty. Isabella had wept, overwhelmed by the simple power of being named. Alexander, too, was reshaped. His empire had not faltered despite the hours he pulled back from work. His managers learned to lead in his stead, while he learned something more valuable: how to be present. The man who once measured success in profits now measured it in bedtime hugs. In the drawings the girls taped to his office wall in the way Isabella's laughter returned to fill a room. 6 months after the adoption was finalized, they gathered in the garden for a small celebration. No grand gestures, no formal banquets, just family and a few close friends. The table was set under strings of lights, flowers from the garden scattered in mason jars. The triplets wore dresses they had chosen themselves, their hair braided with ribbons Isabella had kept tucked away for years. As the evening sun dipped low, Alexander stood to raise a glass of sparkling water. To my family he began, his voice thick with emotion. For years I thought wealth was about what I could build, what I could buy. But tonight, looking at all of you, I understand. The greatest fortune I've ever had is right here. Ilara nudged him with a grin. Does that mean we're richer than your restaurants? Alexander laughed, tears in his eyes. Far richer. The girls cheered their voices, blending into the warm Tuscan night. Isabella reached across the table, taking his hand. In her gaze, he saw not just gratitude but a strength reborn. Later, as the stars began to scatter across the sky, the triplets insisted on one final story. Isabella obliged her voice rising over the gentle hum of crickets. She spoke of 3 stars who had fallen from the heavens wandering lost until they found a home in a castle that had once been silent. The stars shone so brightly that they lit every corner, even the darkest ones, and in doing so they healed the castle itself. When she finished, the girls were quiet, their faces glowing in the candlelight. Then Lucia whispered, "That's us, isn't it?" Isabella nodded, her throat too tight to answer. That night, after the children had drifted to sleep, Alexander and Isabella sat together on the terrace. The villa lay in peaceful silence, but it was no longer empty. It pulsed with life, with belonging. Isabella leaned her head against Alexander's shoulder. "We were broken," she said softly. "All of us. But together somehow we became whole." Alexander kissed her hair, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We didn't just survive," he murmured. "We were reborn." And in that quiet moment under the Florentine stars, the Grant family knew their story was no longer one of loss. It was a story of rediscovery of love chosen and fought for, of lives mended through the courage of opening one's heart. A family not bound by blood, but by something stronger, the decision to never let each other go. From the first crack of thunder on that rain-soaked night in Florence, to the moment the judge's gavel sealed their new beginning, the story of Alexander Isabella Ilarimaris and Lucia is nothing less than a journey from despair to rebirth. What began as chance 3 abandoned girls shivering on the steps of a church became the very force that transformed 2 broken adults into parents who found themselves again through love. Alexander Grant, the billionaire who once lived for deadlines and acquisitions, discovered a truth no balance sheet could ever reveal. Wealth without love is empty. His empire might have been built on steel and contracts, but the legacy he will be remembered for is the family he chose, the children he protected, and the wife he stood beside when the weight of grief nearly crushed her. Isabella's transformation was even more profound. After losing her child and the ability to walk, she had retreated into silence, convinced her story was over. Yet, the very children who had been cast aside by the world became the ones to breathe life back into her. Their laughter filled her empty spaces. Their trust restored her courage. Their love crowned her not with pity, but with purpose. In teaching them to hope again, she rediscovered her own. And the girls, Ilara brave and steady, Maris tender and wise beyond her years, Lucia shy but bursting with quiet strength, proved that children, even in their smallest years, can be agents of healing. They entered the Grant villa with fear in their eyes, uncertain of their place in the world. But over time they blossomed into daughters who knew they belonged, daughters who carried light into every dark corner, daughters who made a house a home. This story is more than an adoption tale. It is a testimony that family is not merely defined by bloodlines, but by commitment, compassion, and the daily choice to love. The legal battles, the interviews, the scrutiny, they were tests of endurance, yes, but they also revealed an undeniable truth. Love that is chosen, fought for, and proven in action is stronger than any obstacle. So, what can we take from this story into our own lives? First, that healing rarely comes in the way we expect. Sometimes the people who enter our lives unexpectedly are the very ones who carry the keys to our recovery. Second, that love is an act, not a feeling. It is shown in pancakes burned but eaten with joy, in bedtime stories told night after night, in standing up in a courtroom and declaring, they are ours. And finally, that no matter how broken we feel, our story is not over. As Isabella showed us, even when the world seems silent, life has a way of surprising us with reasons to rise again. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the strength of love and the resilience of the human heart, I ask you to share that journey with us. Subscribe to the channel so that we can continue bringing you stories that inspire, challenge, and uplift. Your support is not just for us, it's a way to spread hope to remind others that miracles happen when we refuse to give up. Together, let's keep these stories alive.